So welcome everyone. We are on our 16th session today, or I think actually it's the 17th because we split 2.7 into 2. And we'll continue with discussing Anuvaka 2.7 leading into 2.8.1. So the very last bit of 2.7 leading into 2.8.1. If I can get my slides to move. Okay, there we go. All right. So the prelude to this, if you remember what we've talked about in the Brahmanandavali, is that the nature of the Atman is Ananda or bliss. And it explains the unmanifest Brahman as Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam, which translates as existence, knowledge, and infinity. So this unmanifest Brahman manifests as all the creatures, including human beings, in two forms: as a microcosm in each individual creation and as the universe in the microcosm or the Jagat. It resides in every individual in the cave of the heart as Atman. This is the essence of this Upanishad. And then the rest of the verses, explain in detail the path and the method to realize that truth. If you remember, in this Upanishad, we touched a lot on koshas, the Panchakoshas. Introduces us to Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, and the Anandamaya koshas. And with respect to each kosha, food is Brahman to the body, prana is Brahman to the Pranamaya kosha, mind to the Manomaya, intellect is Brahman to the Vijnanamaya, and pleasure or Ananda is Brahman to the Anandamaya kosha. This is Sukha. It is not quite Ananda, but the pleasure that can be achieved in this physical sheath. Transcending all these secondary Brahmins or Anatman, we now come to the absolute Brahman or Atman, who's the support of them all. When these layers or koshas are negated and realized as they are temporary, we are left with nothing to peel but the substratum or the pure Brahman. So why is it called the substratum? Because it's the foundation. Brahman is beyond all empirical relationships. In our daily lives, we assume that if we cannot see, touch, or measure something, it doesn't exist. Since the unmanifest Brahman has no form or physical attributes, the mind naturally asks, is Brahman existing or non-existing? Is there even a Brahman? And this Upanishad gives, with Shankara Bhashya, provides 7 proofs of the existence of Brahman. So we've covered the first 6 in the Anuvakas up to this point in time. First is the cosmological proof. Brahman is the cause of the universe, including all creatures. Then we talked about Brahman that entered as Atman in the cave of the heart and gives life to the inert body and mind. Third proof was that Brahman, appearing as multiple with different names and forms in space and time, or it does appear as multiple names and forms. Then we learned that Brahman is self-made and Sukrita, well-made. And then last week, we talked about the fact that Brahman or the Atman is the source of Ananda. And that Brahman gives sentiency to life, making the inert alive. That Brahman is Ananda. We learned that Atman and realizing that self is the source of Ananda or joy. Today's verse, we split it up, goes into the psychological proof. And we come to the other side of Ananda or joy, or what keeps us from recognizing that Ananda. It says it is the source of fear. Brahman is the source of fear for the ignorant and fearlessness for the wise. So what is ignorance and wisdom, avidya and vidya that we've come across? We'll explore that. And how are they the cause of fear or fearlessness also? We'll explore in the session. Then in the next verse, we introduce to the cosmic law and order. Why is the universe orderly? Why does the wind blow and the sun rise with mathematical precision? Is it fear, or do they follow the cosmic law and order of Brahman? So we look at fear from two angles: at the level of the microcosm, the individual, and fear as it governs the macrocosm of the universe. And the verses explain how the same power that governs the stars is the same rasa or essence that sits within the cave of our own heart. So that's the summary. So I've told you we're going to talk about fear today, fear at the individual level, and how fear holds the universe together, and how those two may be different from each other. So things for you to keep in mind as we go through. We're going to be introduced to the word antaram. And the question related to that is, how do you experience a sense of separation from the world around you? Antaram is separation. So just think about, how do you experience a sense of separation from the world, and how does that fuel your anxiety? So I'm already connecting two things for you. When you feel disconnected, it is a cause of anxiety. So how does it affect you? Pratishta, foundation. What is your practice or source of support to manage your fears? Third, why do you think intellectual knowledge, knowing the theory of this ananda or peace, often fail to remove our actual fear? We know about it. Why doesn't it remove ananda? Why doesn't it remove fear? And then a couple of questions related to 2.8.1, the cosmic law and order. The verse says the sun and the wind act out of fear. How does this ancient view of a governed universe compare to our modern scientific understanding of the laws of physics? And bringing it back down to the individual level, if the sun and the wind are disciplined in their duty, what is the duty or dharma of a human being in this sukrita, well-made world? Just some things to start getting you to think about what we might be talking about in the session and what to listen for. So as I said, the first 6 were cosmological proofs. Now we get into the psychological proof, where Brahman is the source of fear for the ignorant and fearlessness for the wise. So we'll talk about what is fear, what causes it, what is fearlessness, and how do you get there? Okay, and we'll talk about Paravidya, or the higher knowledge, or the true knowledge of the Brahman, and how that gives fearlessness, oneness, and immortality. Okay? All right. So let's get into why do we feel fear. So before we get into the verses themselves, let's talk about fear as we experience it at a human level. So fear has played an important role in the course of human evolution, primarily for biological safety, right? You know, when prehistoric man was faced with a dangerous predator, what was the first response? Fight, flight, or submit, right? So fear is a response to protect, for safety, for the preservation of the being. Very primitive response, and it's called the amygdala hijack, where it's the most primitive part of the brain. A second cause of fear is otherness or duality, which we will be introduced to. That comes from egotism, or the sense of the I, that creates a sense of separation. So I, you, me versus you versus them. So that sense of duality, where you perceive yourself as different. And thirdly, intellectualization, conceptualizing rather than experiencing reality. So it's very, you've taken everything at the level of the intellect, and you shut yourself off from emotion, and you shut yourself off from actually experiencing reality as is. So fear has played a role in the evolution of mankind, and it still continues to serve a purpose. And these are at the very high level, from a psychological perspective, what is the source of fear? Now, remember, in this Upanishad, in the earlier Anuvakas, we've talked a lot about the koshas. So if fear is a human, or it's not just human, animals feel fear too. What sheath does this, how does it manifest in each of these sheaths? How do we experience it? Physical, in the Annamaya kosha, fear of pain, fear of getting old, and fear of dying. Right? We are so attached to our bodies, we're afraid to die. That's where we feel the pain. Energy, pranamaya. fear of exhaustion and loss of vitality, mental, manomaya. If you identify fear of loneliness, rejection, and emotional pain, a source of a lot of our issues with our social and interpersonal relationships, right? If you identify so much at the mental level, then you are going to be plagued by these fears. Intellectual, vijnanamaya, fear of being wrong or losing control. The intellect, if you identify with your intellect as the highest aspect of your existence, then you don't want to be wrong. You're afraid to lose control. And then bliss or anandamaya. Now remember this bliss or anandamaya we're talking about. Anandamaya is still a kosha. It is not the bliss of the Atman. This is sukha. The shadow of fear remains if one fears losing this state of joy, right? What if this is temporary? What if I lose it? It's here 1 minute, gone the next minute. So just a brief introduction to this whole idea of fear that the next two verses are going to talk about. Now let's look at how the Upanishad talks about it, right? This is the psychological aspect of it. Let's look at what the Upanishad says. Yada hyevesha etasmin adrishye anatmaye anirukte anilayane abhayam prathishtam vindate अथ सः अभयं गत भवति यदा हि एव एष एतस्मिन् उदरम् अन्तरं कुरुते अथ तस्य भयं भवति तत्तु एव भयं विदुष मन्वानस्य. So yada, when, he indeed, eva, thus, adrishye, cannot be seen, invisible, anatmaye, without a body, anirukte, that cannot be expressed, anilayane, nilayam is a house, an abode, something that is not housed, that is supportless, needs no foundation. Abhayam, fearlessness, prathishtam, foundation, vindate, finds. Atha, then, so he, abhayam gato bhavati. Fearlessness becomes fearless. He who is established in the oneness of Brahman, the unperceivable, incorporeal, inexplicable, unsupported, becomes free of fear. Let's go to the second part. Yada, when he indeed, eva, truly, esha, this individual, etasmin, in this Brahman, udaram, that is even the slightest, the width of a hair, antaram, difference, gap or separation, kurute, makes, atha, then, tasya, for him, bhayam bhavati, fear arises. Okay? But if the slightest otherness is allowed to enter between himself and this Brahman, then he is smitten with fear. He becomes fearful. Then there's a third part. Tat, that Brahman, tu, but indeed, eva, truly, bhayam, the source of fear, vidushe, for the knower, one who knows only through the intellect and the ego, manvanasya, for the one who considers themselves separate. Okay? So what is the meaning of this? That very same Brahman or being becomes a terror or a source of fear to the so-called learned man who is unreflected. Okay, so three parts to this. First one, it describes the Brahman as anirukte, adrishye, anatmaye, anirukte, anilayane, unperceivable, incorporeal, cannot be explained, without a foundation. One who's established in that Brahman, prathishtate, who's established in it, is free from fear. But if the slightest gap is allowed to arise, then that individual is smitten with fear. And then it talks about the wise man to whom this Brahman becomes a source of fear if that knowledge is only intellectual knowledge and it's not realized knowledge. And let's dive into that to understand that a little bit more. Okay? It says for the ignorant person, Brahman is a source of fear. And for the wise, in this case, wise is not intellectually and egotistically wise, it is the realized soul. It becomes a source of fearlessness. So the description of Brahman, we've talked about it. So few keywords to draw your attention to. Free from fear, or abhayam. Bhayam is fear, abhayam is fearless. Abhayam becomes he who attains such a vision of oneness. When you realize the same space of bliss in you is the same space in everyone else, there is no other to harm you, judge you, or take from you. Okay? Shankara says the self cannot be afraid of itself. You are only afraid if you perceive the other as different from you. Then yes, that person can become a source of threat, or that creature can become a source of threat, or that situation can become a source of threat. Antaram, the inner gap. Why do we feel fear? Fear and anxiety arise from the other, the duality that I just talked about. The other is perceived by the brain as a source of threat and leads to a response based on fear. But if the slightest otherness is allowed to enter, then he is smitten with fear. That's the verse. So even if you're 99% spiritual, but keep 1% of your ego, fear will find a way in. And this sense of duality, the sense of separation from you and the other or any part of the world, is the cause of our fear, and fear is a source of anxiety. And in the third bit, that very same being becomes a terror to the so-called learned man who is unreflective. Why? The learned have gathered information, but they have not had the vision of oneness, because still identified with ego, they see truth as something outside of themselves rather than in their own heart. So imagine a God who's seen as an external force who judges becomes a source of fear, whereas the God within you, that Atman within you, there is no, how can you be afraid of yourself, right? So it says, he who knows all the information could also be very proud of what he knows. Again, the ego comes in. The God then is externalized to a vengeful, punishing God who's watching what you do, rewarding you, and punishing you as needed. Okay, so that concept is what is being challenged in this verse and explained, saying there should be no duality. And a very nice example here of the wave in the ocean. When the small wave realizes I am made of water, that big wave is also made of water, and this vast ocean too is water, the moment the wave recognizes the oneness of water, fear vanishes. It realizes it cannot be swallowed by the ocean because it is the ocean. So what happens? The ocean that was once a source of terror is now its very own self, right? So that's a simile or an explanation of what is the source of oneness. How do we lose this sense of separateness? Is when you realize that it is the same energy, the same divine consciousness that pervades, animates each of us. And then this one says, tadapyesha shloko bhavati iti. So it's just like everything else. It says tadapi, concerning that also. This shloko bhavati. There is another verse. It's just a connector to the next verse that we're going to talk about, the Shaptamo Anuvakaha, 7th lesson. And so one example of this kind of ignorance that leads to fear is we've talked about it many times. The concept of a rope and a snake in Vedanta serves as an analogy for the relationship between perception and reality. It illustrates how ignorance can cause misperceptions, like a rope for a snake. It explains what may appear as an illusion is actually an effect of deeper understanding. It emphasizes the importance of knowledge in overcoming misconceptions. So knowledge not to be trashed as it's not important. What the previous verse said is, knowledge alone is not enough, but that knowledge has to be married, or that knowledge has to be about that oneness of the Atman and the Brahman. Okay, so how can we overcome this fear arising from an error of perception? We will see it. For now, we will go into the next verse. So this first verse talked about Brahman as a source both of fear and fearlessness at the microcosmic level. Now let's see how this plays out in the macrocosm, and how do we understand the word fear over here. Bhishasmat vatah pavate, bhisha udeti suryah, bhisha asmat agnischa indrascha, mrityu dhavati panchamiti. Bhisha is bhiya, fear. Out of fear, asmat of him, vata, the wind, pavate, it blows. Bhisha, out of fear, udeti suryah, rises the sun. Bhisha, out of fear, asmat of him, agnischa indrascha, the fire and Indra perform their duties. Mrityu, death, dhavati, runs. Panchamaha, the fifth iti, this is the command. So out of fear of him the wind blows, out of fear of him the sun rises, out of fear runs fire as also Indra. Now this running doesn't mean they're running away. Running means the running of the universe, operations. And Yama, the Lord of Death, as the fifth principle, also functions out from this fear of this Brahman. So the wind blows, the sun rises, the fire burns, Indra manages the universe, and Yama takes care of this cycle of birth and death. What does fear in this context mean? The core theme of this verse is the cosmic law or rita. I think a better word than fear is awe, right? Or it is not fear, but it is the laws of the universe that keeps the universe functioning, or rita. So this is actually the fear that is being talked about here is the cosmic law. It implies that every natural force has a boundary it cannot cross, right? The old cannot become young again. A tiger will not give birth to a zebra. There are some laws of the universe. The sun always rises in the east. So the laws of the universe that keep this universe functioning is what is talked about here as awe. Even though it is called bhisha, it is awe. So Vayu represents the movement and breath of the world. Sun, Surya represents time, light, and the source of all energy. Fire, Agni, represents transformation and the metabolic energy of life. Indra represents the heavens, the mind, and the king of the senses. Yama represents the ultimate limit of death, reminding us that even the end of life follows a divine schedule. Everybody is born, everybody has to die. It's the law of the universe. Anything that is born has to come to an end. Brahman is the absolute consciousness as the silent governor behind the visible world. And so the fear mentioned here is actually cosmic law. What is a modern parallel? What the Upanishads call fear of Brahman, modern science calls the fundamental constants of physics, like the speed of light or gravity. Both acknowledge that the universe operates under a strict, intelligent, and predictable order that prevents it from collapsing into entropy. So if gravity didn't exist, right, everything is going to collapse. So the planets revolve around the sun. You've got everything going in its belt. Everything in the universe happens in an orderly fashion. It is to say, there is an intelligence. They all function in relation to each other and in relation to some universal energy that keeps all of this going. So that is the parallel to the bhisha or the bhaya that is being talked about in this verse. So let's summarize it. Ashokan has summarized it for us, pulling out the key terms that we need to pay attention to. And how do we get from abhaya to bhisha? So the key word abhaya, fearlessness, in the cosmic order is awe, and fear disappears inwardly and governs outwardly, right? So abhayam is your inner fear goes away. And in the macrocosmic level, what happens? It is the governing force of the universe. So the context of this is they talk about fear for inner realization. One who experiences oneness will not experience fear. Only he who sees this duality will experience fear. Cosmic functioning, the microcosm to the macrocosm. Condition, I just talked about it, no duality. The sense of this antaram or difference is removed. In the cosmic order, there's absolute law and order. And non-duality sustains order. Everything is part of the same energy. You don't have the sun as one source of, following a different set of rules, and the moon following a different set of rules, the earth following a different set of rules, nature following a different set of rules. Everything follows the same set of rules. If separation exists, fear arises, disorder, and fear belongs to duality. Disorder is not possible at the macrocosmic level. If it does, that is pralaya. That's the end of the universe. Who fears at the individual level? The ignorant. What does fear govern? The universal functioning. And cosmos obey what the ego resists. Who is fearless? The knower of Brahman. At the cosmic level, everybody's following it, and only the knower transcends fear. Who's the only person or the only being that is fearless, that transcends fear, is the Brahman. And this is a flow chart just to show how these concepts have all been knit together. Okay, so Ananda Mimamsa, inner realization begin when one abides in the imperceptible. Reality of fearlessness is the result. If there's a sense of duality, even a slight gap, then fear arises. Then what is the correction? The pivot is to the non-dual reality. The realization that the same reality enervates all of us, that becomes the pratishta or the support for the fearlessness within. Then we move to 2.8, which is the cosmic order of the outer world. Cosmic awe and order, the bhisha, meaning out of awe of him, the wind blows, the sun rises, fire functions, death runs, surya udeti. So the meaning is the cosmos, because of the sense of non-duality, functions perfectly obeying the laws of the universal consciousness. So what is the lesson to be learned for us? Remove the sense of otherness and fear dissolves. Recognize Brahman as the self, freedom within, order without. So that is the spiritual teaching of this. Now, how do you remove fear? Okay, removing the sense of duality, realizing this oneness of the self, that is our ultimate goal. But we as human beings have many, many koshas. Remember, we talked about how many koshas the sphere sits in. So where do we start? So Val has very helpfully put together a set of slides around how do you shift the sphere at the levels that we are at the psychological level, at the level of the, of the body, at the level of the mind, at the level of the intellect, at the level of the ego. How do you get rid of fear? So if you remember, we've talked about bhaya, the result of duality, the sense of otherness. We've talked about this in the Yoga Sutras. There are three kinds of fear: adhyatmic, adibhautik, and adidevik. So the adhyatmic is self-created. Adibhautik is external. Someone else hurts you. A dog bites you. Okay, adhibhautik. Pain that is inflicted on you from an external source. Adhyatmic is pain you inflict on yourself. Something may have happened that was painful. It is long gone in the past, but you keep it alive and you nurture it and continue to enjoy feeling the pain. Adibhautik is external. Adidevik, cosmic, natural forces, right? A cyclone, a tsunami, death. And what is causing this fear? Another thing is an unknown Brahmin who is perceived as judgmental, an external God who is who punishes, who holds you to certain laws of conduct. It is somebody outside judging you. Okay, so that is fear. So what is the perceptual shift from duality to oneness? What happens? Swarupa Abhayam. Now remember, this is the Advaita perspective. Essential nature is birthless and deathless. That your Atman is never born, it never dies, it just is, it continues. Jnanaja abhayam, fearlessness through knowledge. Self-dependence, realizing that your Atman is the substrate or the foundation, and you know that Brahman is the foundation of your Ananda. All other pleasures are transient, transitory, you're going to lose it, but realization that that soul or that Atman within you is imperishable is the foundation of your peace. So what shifts from fear to fearlessness? So Vidya is the only thing that can permanently shift fear to fearlessness. While willpower or bravery can help face a specific fear, Vidya or correct knowledge reduces that fear entirely, dissolves the root of it. So we've talked about Aparavidya and Paravidya. Aparavidya is the intellectual or material knowledge, science, medicine, status, religious rituals, right? Everything that we value and treasure, the maximum that our intellects, the most educated, the most titled, the most degreed, the most well-versed in all the Vedas, is still Aparavidya. While useful, it doesn't end fear because it deals with the outer space of objects that are transient and changing. What you know today will change tomorrow because of a new discovery, right? AI is going to take over. They tell us all the jobs. It's the latest bogeyman, which shows everything that we know. But all that is Aparavidya. It is any knowledge related to this material universe is Aparavidya. Paravidya, the experiential realization of the Atman. This is the knowledge that I am the space in which all experiences occur. So what is the highest form of Vidya is that knowledge of the Atman. It is where your intellect and ego stop functioning and you're opening yourself up to a higher level of consciousness, which the Upanishads tell us that all of us have. We all have that ability, but as long as your intellect and ego are your main source of interacting with this world, this Atman will remain hidden from you. That's why it cannot be described, it cannot be perceived. Because nothing, our words, our intellect, our ability to conceptualize, it is beyond all that. So we're using a set of tools with our intellect and our ego, which is never going to let you achieve the Atman or realize the Atman. That knowledge of that Atman, how to get there is Paravidya. That is ultimately how you remove fear. Okay, at a very human level, how can we use this knowledge that we gain, everything that we're studying, right? Don't get attached to the transient and the transitory. How are we going to convert this to our sense of fearlessness? 3 stages. You will remember this also from the Yoga Sutras. Shravana, hearing, exposing the mind to the truth of Purnam or wholeness. Manana, reflection, using our intellect to stress test these ideas until they make logical sense. You reflect on it, you think about it. Understand, they're not dissing the intellect, but they're saying that alone is not enough. Finally, where do you get? Once you know where to go, the Shravana establishes in your heart and your mind that this is worth following. There is something more that I need to go for. Manana, reflection, you start making the connections. Then you hit a dead end. You realize you need to go further. Nididhyasana, meditation, prayer, faith is where it comes in. Living in that space of the heart until the knowledge moves from your head to every cell in your body. Your intuition is the whisper of the soul. Cultivate that intuition and allow it to break free of your intellect to realize this Atman. When Vidya is right, fearlessness isn't something you do, it is who you are. Right? You see the photographs of the Buddha, of Krishna, surrounded by animals. The animals don't fear him. He doesn't fear the animals. There's a complete sense of peace and oneness. It is who Krishna was. It is who Buddha was. All right. So we'll get to the summary of the perceptual shifts. The perception of reality. The ignorant perspective is one of duality or dvaita. You see separation, the other. You see a multitude rather than the energy that courses through it. You see many bulbs rather than the electricity that innovates it all. The wise sees oneness. non-duality, unity, is able to see the connection. And at a very basic level, if you start breaking down the barriers and the walls between you and people around you, situations around you, that alone, you understand the essential humanity. With an animal, it's the same consciousness. What is the experience of Brahman? To the ignorant, it's of an external, judgmental, punishing God. Oh, I have to do my duty because otherwise God will punish me. I shouldn't steal because God will punish me. Fear is a pretty effective tool to bring people in line. But that is ignorance. When it is internalized, that self or Atman, that becomes the source of abhaya. What is the nature of fear? Caused by the threat of the other. And if there is no other, then there is nothing to fear. So an analogy is the wave seeing itself as separate from the ocean, or the wave realizing that it is the ocean, it is the same water. And the resulting state is the ignorant experience anxiety, insecurity, and they're constantly dependent on the world for their peace of mind, transient happiness. You chase after temporary achievements, objects of enjoyment, and you delight in it. But we all know that it is going to change. Whereas for the wise, the peace and security you realize is self-dependent. Only you are both the architect of your own peace and the experiencer of your own peace. Your fear and your anxiety is self-created. And according to the Upanishad, it comes from the sense of duality. All right. So let's get back to the questions. We talked about this gap. How do you experience a sense of separation from the world around you? Just think about it, right? What are the situations where you feel the sense of duality? You're afraid, you're anxious. Pratishta, what is your practice or source of support to manage your fears? And the third question about the wise man who is unreflective, Brahman becoming the source of fear. Why do you think that? That just knowing about peace often fails to remove our actual fear. Related to the cosmic law and order, the verse says that the sun and the wind act out of fear. We talked about this fear being more awe. How does this ancient view of a governed universe compare to our modern scientific understanding of the law of physics? And then if the sun and the wind are disciplined and they do their dharma based on this awe of fear, what is the duty or dharma of a human being in this well-made world? Okay. Broad question. All right. So with that, let me stop the recording and turn it over for discussion.